being in the diagnostic lab, well, I think Pork Expo is a great example of, you know, it should have been a pig in retrospect, but we've got a lot of inputs that go into pig production, and you know, you've got a lot of examples of different entities involved in that production. Depending on their perspective, you know, what's the most important part of the elephant, i.e. the pig that we're trying to produce pork, right? And you know, where I sit, my perspective is in the infectious disease category, but I try to, we as diagnosticians try to recognize, you know, that all the rest of these inputs are important as well, and they all kind of interrelate. So, next. It comes to my mind that not everybody's read Sherlock Holmes, right? But Sherlock Holmes is kind of my hero, you know. I read a lot when I was young. And I just use this for an anecdote. Dr. Watson's a sidekick. Sherlock, this note is indeed a mystery. What do you imagine that it means? Speculation, right? Speculation. Next. Sherlock, I have no data yet. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Right? Next. Insensibly. And this is the human nature part, the psychology part. Insensibly. One begins to twist the facts to suit theories, rather than theories to suit facts. And so our whole effort in the diagnostic lab is try to be factual, not come to a conclusion before we have the facts, right? So that's just a perspective of where I come from. Next. And over the years at the College of Veterinary, evidence-based medicine, evidence-based diagnostics, evidence-based decisions. We believe that is our continuous improvement goal for our profession. Okay. So some concepts. Why are intestinal disease important? It's pretty obvious. You guys have all been in the industry. Boy, we have animals that don't grow well, that die, that have to be culled, don't get optimal premiums, cost of treatment, cost of interventions. You write about that every day. Welfare perceptions, you know, demand, that sort of thing. So those are all important. I guess I'd take the next slide. To me, I think I frame it up a little bit differently. I grow up, I'm the son of a depression, guy that grew up in a depression. So waste bothers, right? He instilled that. And of course we talk about feed efficiency. Feed efficiency, if we're not optimizing that, we're wasting feed. Well, what's feed, right? You know, sunlight, air, water, soil, energy all go into feed. Scarce resources world here we're talking about, right? So that all goes into feed. And then we add to the feed some energy and labor as well to get protein for people. So, next slide. You know, I'm looking at intestinal disease having a huge impact on our resource efficiency, our ability to convert scarce resources to edible protein. And it does it sort of subliminally, sort of below the radar sometimes, right? So, next. You know, you can put some numbers to the obvious things, you know, a dollar here, a dollar there for deaths, for treatment, whatever. Economic reality today is that a decrease in feed efficiency of 1/10 of a pound translates to about $3.50 per pig lost opportunity, right? So we're talking a subtle change in feed efficiency has major economic impact and resource utilization efficiency, right? And anytime you multiply this over a large number of pigs, that's a really, really big number, right? Enteric diseases waste resources, and I guess the real point when I talk about a large number of pigs is these enteric compromises that we see are extremely common. Next. And why is that? Well, the concept here is this endemic disease. Most of the pathogens that affect pigs in modern pork production are always there, right? All these bugs we diagnose every day. I consider them to be potential pathogens because they don't always have to cause disease. When you're considering what creates disease here, it's not only the bug, but it's the environment we put them in, the facilities, the management. Susceptible host, are they immune or not, the genotype, whatever. you have these risk factors that allow these bugs that are always there to express disease, right? So we have all these interrelationships we have to be pondering as we think about disease control. Next. So what is it we find? Common infectious cause of enteric disease in pigs greater than 6 weeks of age. I just summarized kind of the top guys, if you will, in a Pareto chart here. With Salmonella, Ileitis, PPE and Ileitis, E. coli, rotavirus, TG. This is the frequency of diagnosis, right? We diagnose them all virtually every day, but we diagnose more of some, right? Next. What we see at a diagnostic lab is generally pigs are sick. I can recognize, I can see they're sick. We send in samples, and we try to get a diagnosis, a disease diagnosis. With the intestine particularly, you can have considerable intestinal dysfunction, but yet when you visualize the animal, you really can't see them sick, right? They're not doing as well as they could be doing, but you can't measure that with your eye. And so you have this idea that there's, under the surface of visualization, there's a huge part of an iceberg that's potentially causing some danger, some risk or some compromise. And so the concept of subclinical disease enters into our discussions, particularly when we're talking enteric disease. Next. I won't go off on my philosophy of the unknown, but from where I sit, I've got to always be aware of what I don't know. I'm not sure a lot of people with confidence out there really think that way, right? I know the answer, right? Because of my experience and education. But from where I sit in the D lab, I don't. I always got to have, what else could it be, and what is it I don't know? So there's a lot of unknowns in this bottom of the iceberg, frankly. Next. So what about ileitis specifically? This is same information you've probably been exposed to for the last 20 years, right? It's very common. At least 96% of farms are seropositive, are infected. It's a very common infection, common. So that's a huge part of the impact of an agent, right? It's common. And it's the same way all over the world. It's very hard to eliminate from pig populations. And it affects pigs and a few other species, not people, so we don't have it as a food safety issue. Disease impact. This is where you get into the bar fights, right? How big a deal is it? It's very common, but how big a deal is it? What's the impact on pigs? My standard answer for virtually any question in biology is, it depends, right? Every time you want to drill down and get a specific answer, it sort of depends on the context. I think a couple of take-homes, though, to me, is it affects grow finish. When the impact of the disease is the greatest, right? You got a lot invested, they're growing, now they're not growing. Anything from acute deaths to just some diarrhea, stunning, variation of slaughter, to what we call some clinical, some stuff that we haven't been able to measure until we started actually keeping records and comparing control programs and vaccination programs. All forms of disease are still common. Diagnosis of disease requires that we actually look at the animals and look for lesions and use some tools. Subclinical disease probably is going to require a different set of tools, and that's going to be more in the records, being able to compare next. Just another example, what does it really cost? Estimates, this is the bar fight part, right? Estimates vary all over the board. $6 to $8 a pig is where a lot of people come in, but really the answer depends. Again, as I was working up a spreadsheet for the situation, we have 6/10 to a tenth cost of gain, or feed efficiency here is going to be roughly $3 a pig. Deaths, culls, medication, vaccine, you can take it back to the spreadsheet, you can see how the results fit in. Very conservative numbers, and I still come up with these $6 that it's costing virtually every pig produced out there. And it can be much higher. Next. It's kind of a bunny trail here when we were talking about ileitis, but really in my world I'm talking about enteric diseases compromising, utilization of resources. Then, as you recall, next on the list, or first on the list, was salmonella. The ecology of salmonella is very similar to that of ileitis. Very common infection. You don't always see the effect of it, right? So we see a lot of cases of salmonella. There's a lot of different kinds of salmonella out there. The big ones being Tollus, Hyder, and Typhimurium in terms of severity of the disease that cause. Next. Back to the original Pareto chart. So I'm here to suggest that both salmonella and ileitis are clinical disease and subclinical disease, and they are extremely common. Okay. How common are they? Is it changing over time? This is years on the bottom, 2003 through 2010. We have salmonella, frequency of diagnosis, the D-Lab. You see a big peak here. This peak is generally a function of how we're reporting our isolations. This peak isn't really real. But we did have an increase, during the circovirus era. And I guess the take-home message is it hasn't gone away, right? Lawsonia, on the other hand, it's been fairly steady over the years, and we're still seeing it. It's still common. I mentioned earlier unknowns, right? What else is out there that could look like that? Or what else is on our radar? Brachyspire has been kind of a low prevalence disease. Well, it's still out there. We have to be aware of that. But I'm throwing in here unknown here, colitis. As a pathologist sitting in a diagnostic lab, sometimes the agent isn't demonstrable. Sometimes the lesion isn't specific. And so you go, these pigs aren't right, but I don't know what it is, right? So the awareness of the unknowns, what else are we missing, right? So just for some context there. Next. You look at seasonality. These diseases, yeah, they're common. They haven't gone away. The season matter, not too much. For salmonella, it's all times of the year. What about ileitis? Well, maybe a little bump late summer. But basically, we see it all the time. Thanks. Age. Early nursery, early grower, late grower, finish. The frequency of diagnosis. Salmonella really loves to capitalize on the compromised pig post-weaning. Right? A lot of infections occur there. And if that pig can't respond with vigor, salmonella is going to cause disease. We see that decreasing over time. To late finisher, generally you don't have very many acute outbreaks of salmonella alone. Ileitis, on the other hand, goes up. The older they get, the more likely disease could occur, and that's at a time when you have the biggest impact, right? You got a lot of investment in that pig already. Next. Well, maybe they're just happening together. Right? Maybe one was predisposed to the other. And that's kind of an interesting question in my head because, ileitis has a fairly long incubation period. Salmonella doesn't. So what if they have ileitis, they're more likely to have salmonella? Well, most of the time we don't find them together. So that sort of says maybe they're acting independently. Thanks. We do have good tools for diagnosis of both of these agents. Back to ileitis now for the rest of this discussion. What I would say is you cannot tell by looking at the feces what the agent is, right? And we have a lot of practitioners, a lot of veterinarians, producers. Oh, that's DG, that's salmonella, that's ileitis, right? Just by looking at feces, I don't think so. They just don't know that they're wrong. Okay. Gross lesions are helpful, but I continue to be educated after 20 years of how I cannot make the assumption, looking at a piece of tissue grossly, what the agent is. I need additional tests. PCR certainly helps. Helps us in that process. We can confirm infection with that, not necessarily disease. Serology, very helpful indicator of when it's occurring, how many pigs are affected. And of course we use histopathology, looking at a lesion microscopically and finding the organism within the crypt epithelium. With an immunohistochemistry test, that's sort of our gold standard for disease diagnosis. Thanks. And I threw this in here, probably a little bit too detailed a lot. When you have severe disease, you got severe lesions, you got lots of bugs, right? Subclinical disease, these are two examples of animals sent in for another problem. Enteric disease not suspected. You have just a little bit of bug and a little bit of lesion of all the guts you look at, right? And so that's probably a mechanism by which subclinical occurs, right? Below the threshold of visual observation clinically, but yet there's some pathologic effect. Throw this in here as, you know, a pig exposed to an infection. We've already said it's pretty much inevitable they're going to be exposed, right? Disease may or may not occur at whatever severity. We mentioned the incubation period being short for, oops, I turned this around. Yeah, this is fine. Lawsonia a couple of weeks, salmonella a couple of days. If we look at antibody using serology, with a pig, we can see that it was born with some antibody, maternal immunity kind of goes away. Somewhere along the line it gets infected. You have a couple of weeks of incubation period here, and then the disease expression, and then the antibody forms and the animal becomes immune. That's what happens with one pig. I think a common misperception out there is, gee, these pigs are all come from the same source, they're all weaned within a day, or 3 days, or 3 days of age, you know, no variation in age, same feed, same genetics, same everything. So infections occurring simultaneously. Next slide. In fact, the infection is very progressive over time, right? And so not every pig is equal. You can't look at a pig and predict the population. My time up? All right.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So in a population of pigs, you know, this one pig is still reacting the same way, but now you have to overlay all the same graph starting from each of these other time points. So you got about 1,000 time points in a finisher of 1,000 pigs, right? And so that's where it gets a little fuzzy of how do we assess populations. We do pretty good with a pig. Next. Why is it important we even do that? Interventions, conceptually here, is kind of important. For a vaccine to be effective, it needs to be at least 2 to 3 weeks before infection occurs, which is 2 to 3 weeks before the disease occurs, which is 2 to 3 weeks before seroconversion occurs, right? So you've got to vaccinate them 6 to 8 weeks ahead of when you detect antibody, right? Along that timeline. In contrast, the antimicrobial interventions, i.e. we want to treat the agent or medicate these animals after they're infected to eliminate that infection, right? And so you have the strategies of antimicrobial prophylaxis, pulse dosing, and they have merit. But you got to know when to pulse them, and it has to be after infection. You can't do it before, right? And probably have to do it multiple times because this infection is occurring at different ages. And the easy alternative for that would be just to medicate them all the time. And we know as an industry that's really not sustainable, right? So we're trying to decrease the amount of antimicrobials we use with an effective product with vaccination. So generally what we're trying to do with vaccine placement is placing it, again, before infection occurs, before disease occurs, and before seroconversion occurs. So that's probably one of the goals here of intervening for this particular disease. Same could be true for salmonella as well. Right? Tools, serology, again using Lawsonia as an example. Serology, detecting antibody. Everybody, you know, most of our veterinarians and a lot of our producers are just, their model for thinking is PERT, right? In the world of serology, it really depends what question you're trying to answer, is what role serology would have, right, for answering questions. And if you simply want to know, have pigs ever been infected with this agent? Do I have it in my farm? You probably go out here to an older age, right, and this serum antibody will tell you, yeah, I've seen this agent, right? So that answers that question. It doesn't tell you when or how many necessarily. How many are infected over time? Well, you probably have to take multiple samples over time and look for prevalence. How many samples? Well, it depends on level of confidence, right? Fewer samples, the less confident you're going to pick up positives or no true prevalence. Most of the time we're in that 10 to 30 animals per time point. When does infection start? Really important when you're going to be thinking about, am I going to medicate these animals with antibiotics, or when do I place vaccination, right? So the tools, I think BI has done a fantastic job of putting together these tools of knowing how to react and when to react with this particular disease, Lawsonia. Next. So I think my time's about up, probably. Sorry. But diagnosis is part of the process, and you know, in the big scheme of things, virtually everything you do is part of the process, right? In our world, you cannot replace going out looking at pigs, observing pigs, collecting information, collecting diagnostic data, using these tools to think about biology, think and research and analyze what are some of our options, and answer that old question that's always runs through my mind is, does this make sense? Does this make sense? Okay. And why do we do all that? Well, not just treatment or control, but to identify continuous improvement opportunities, right? And that's where I started with resource utilization, feed efficiency. What's the cost of compromised feed to gain that we can't see visually, but we can recognize with the checkbook, right? So we're always kind of looking for refining processes. Next. And I think I just summarized basically what I was trying to say in the previous slide, right? We don't want to waste resources. Very common disease. Very common disease. Both of these, right? And we'll use data and tools to collect that data for evidence-based decisions.